History has had its fair share of tyrants who brought suffering and death to millions, and unfortunately even today in the 21st century, we still have some leaders who keep their citizens under an iron grip. But no one lives forever, and leaders with extreme narcissism sometimes cause their own health to take a terrible turn. Call it divine retribution, karma, or natural justice, some of these dictators suffer mysterious, horrible, and frankly ironic deaths. Today we're going to look at two of the worst dictators in modern history who suffered horrible, weird, and in one case a darkly ironic death, showing us even the most powerful tyrants can face poetic justice. Vladimir Lenin, this 20th century dictator, had a very strange disease that eventually killed him at the relatively young age of 53. There are some who see Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution, as a hero that fought for the freedom of workers and peasants of the erstwhile Russian Empire and laid the foundation for the Soviet Union. But there is no doubt his policies and the consequences of the Russian Revolution, the subsequent Civil War, and the Red Terror caused the deaths of an estimated 7 to 12 million Russians. Among other policies, he's also known to have instituted the Gulag. No, not that Gulag. A system of forced labor camps that imprisoned and worked to death up to 1.7 million Soviet prisoners. In 1921, after the conclusion of the Russian Civil War, Lenin began to experience chronic headaches, insomnia, and fainting spells. This would mark the beginning of a cat and mouse chase with the Grim Reaper over the next 2 years. He had already dodged 3 assassination attempts, one in 1918 that left him seriously wounded. He even contemplated suicide because of all the exhaustion and pain he was suffering from, and asked his wife, and Stalin of all people, to acquire cyanide for this purpose. In May 1922, he had his first stroke. He became paralyzed and temporarily lost his ability to speak. For those of you who don't know what a stroke occurs if there's a blockage or bleeding from the blood vessels in the brain, which can result in brain damage. At the time, his physicians were mystified. He was only 51, exercised regularly, and except for working to excess, had a decidedly healthy lifestyle. Later, when his neurological problems progressed, they wondered if lead leaking from a bullet lodged in his neck, or possibly syphilis contracted from a former mistress, was causing his symptoms. The bullet was surgically removed, and a blood test for syphilis was negative, but the symptoms persisted. In December 1922, he suffered his second stroke, which marked the end of his political career and paralyzed his right side. And then in March 1923, Lenin had a third, final stroke and completely lost his ability to speak. On the 21st of January 1924, Lenin fell into a coma and died later that day at age 53, most probably from aspiration of his stomach contents into his lungs, as he had lost the ability to swallow. He literally drowned in his stomach acid, which is a really gruesome way to go. But things got very strange during his autopsy. As he had multiple strokes, the doctors were very interested in the state of the blood vessels of Lenin's brain. When they opened up his skull, what they found shocked them. The doctor found that when he tapped one of these arteries with a surgical forceps, it made a mineral sound as if it was made of stone. The large blood vessels in Lenin's brain looked like they had fossilized. Had Lenin faced off with the Medusa? This may sound fantastic and very weird, and it did puzzle the doctors at the time. What we now know is the blood vessels have been stiffened by atheromatous plaques, and these underwent a process of calcification, which made the arteries feel as if they were full of little rocks. The shocking thing was the extent of this calcification. Almost all the large blood vessels in his brain were affected. Now maybe you're still thinking, it sounds too fantastic. All his blood vessels were lined with calcium crystals? Now I can speak from personal experience. There are patients who, for a lack of better word, we call vasculopaths. For reasons like diabetes, high blood pressure, hyperlipidemia, or cigarette smoking, they have widespread atherosclerosis. Now, there is a procedure which I do very often on my patients in the ICU or before a major surgery, which is to insert a line into one of their smaller arteries in the wrist. This allows us to directly measure the blood pressure and take blood samples directly from this artery. One of the steps in this procedure involves feeding a thin flexible wire, also called a guide wire, into the artery, just to guide the line in. When you thread this wire into a vasculopath's artery, you can literally feel the stony resistance to the guide wire. It's like chipping away at crumbling rocks. It's very distinctive. So I do believe what they found in Lenin's autopsy could be accurate. But what could have caused so much damage to a man in his early 50s with a healthy lifestyle? Lenin did not smoke and even forbade people to light a cigarette in his presence. He drank moderately and was in no way obese. There is one clue, however. Lenin's father, Ilya Ulyanov, died at the age of 54 years of, guess what? A stroke. 3 of Lenin's siblings also died of cardiovascular disease. It seems something was running in the family causing severe atherosclerosis. To this day, we still don't know what it was exactly that caused all of this. There is a genetic mutation in what is called the NT5E gene, which is associated with calcifications of the arteries of the lower limbs and joints. Researchers think there might be a variant that affected the arteries in Lenin's brain. However, the autopsy and analyses at the time did not rule out other, more exotic causes of arterial disease, some with names like homocystinemia, pseudoxanthoma elasticum, or Fabry disease. Thus, mystery still surrounds the death of Vladimir Lenin. Many of the documents regarding his death remain classified to this day. So maybe he did have a run-in with a very selective Russian Medusa. Stalin. Смерть одного человека – трагедия, смерть миллиона – статистика. A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. This quote is widely attributed to Joseph Stalin, and whether he actually said it or not, there is no doubt in my mind he is one of the most brutal dictators of all time. The successor to Lenin, Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin, took over the leadership of the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin, and in the subsequent years up till his death took the former Russian Empire, which was still stuck in the 19th century, and dragged it, kicking and screaming, into the 20th century, creating a global superpower that put the first man in space. However, the human cost was untold suffering and deaths in excess of 20 million by some estimates. The Great Purge from 1936 to 1938 was a campaign to eliminate internal opposition and resulted in mass arrests and executions. Historians estimate the total death toll from the purges alone to be between 700,000 and 1.2 million. Other atrocities and state-engineered famines would account for many millions more. The entire Stalinist system was built on a cult of personality and extreme paranoia. Both guilty and innocent could end up with a bullet behind the neck. Even the executioners would be executed after serving their purpose. At the height of his reign, there was no doubt that Stalin was the most powerful man on earth, simply due to the nature and size of the totalitarian state he ruled with an iron fist. This would make the nature and circumstances behind his death even more ironic. In the run-up to Stalin's death in 1953, Stalin engineered what was called the Doctors' Plot, Dela Vrachey, alleging that an anti-Soviet group of doctors was plotting to murder leading government officials and Stalin himself. This was later proven to be totally fabricated by Stalin himself and was to be used to initiate yet another purge of Soviet society. 2 of the 9 prominent doctors initially accused in the Doctors' Plot died under torture, before the case was ultimately declared a fabrication. While only these 2 were killed in direct connection with the central case, hundreds of other doctors were also imprisoned and many died while in detention. Joseph Stalin's health had begun to deteriorate towards the end of the Second World War. He had atherosclerosis as a result of heavy smoking. He suffered a mild stroke in May 1945 and a severe heart attack in October 1945. He was also known to have uncontrolled high blood pressure. Now this was a ticking time bomb. On the night before his death, Stalin had been heavily drinking with his buddies and had retired alone to his bedroom and gave instructions to his staff not to disturb him. But shortly afterwards, he had a severe stroke and collapsed violently. Despite hearing suspicious noises, his guards were too scared to open the door to check.
Should we investigate?
Should you shut the fuck up before you get us both killed?
Stalin had been lying in a pool of his own urine for the better part of the morning until his staff worked up the courage to go in and check. Stalin's housekeeper found him lying on the floor. He was unconscious, breathing heavily, incontinent, and unresponsive. The initial response again was characteristic of the fear and paranoia that pervaded the Soviet system. If something like this happened in our presence, we would probably call for medical help, right? Stalin's staff called the Politburo, the governing body of the Soviet Union, and they took the whole day debating what to do, and eventually on the next day a group of so-called medical experts were called in. Their examination revealed a high blood pressure of 190 by 110 and a right-sided paralysis. It looked like Comrade Stalin had suffered a catastrophic hemorrhagic stroke, where he had actually ruptured a blood vessel in his head and it bled into his brain. Now, personally, I come across these situations on a regular basis. Usually, if it's too catastrophic, we just allow the patient to pass away comfortably. However, you can do a few things to treat a brain bleed, like controlling the blood pressure with medications, keeping the patient's head elevated by 15 to 30 degrees, giving oxygen, reducing the pressure in the skull with medications like mannitol. All these measures are to prevent something called a secondary brain injury, which follows from the initial bleeding injury to the brain. But what did the so-called medical experts do with Stalin? Over the next 2 days, they attempted to lower his blood pressure with a variety of medications, and even the application of 8 leeches to his neck and face. Despite this novel treatment, Stalin's blood pressure had risen to 210 by 120, and he continued to deteriorate. Subsequently, the leeches were sent to the Gulag as Vrag Naroda. At this point, I'm not even surprised if this actually happened. Stalin died at 0950 on the 5th of March 1953. His death was ironic on many levels. He was the single most powerful man on earth, responsible for the destiny of millions. He could have been spared such a humiliating death if maybe he hadn't killed the best doctors in Moscow. Even his own cult of fear stopped his subordinates from getting him the prompt treatment he needed, and he had to lie in his own urine for the whole day. The most powerful man on earth now couldn't even control his own bladder. He couldn't speak. He had lost all control at the most fundamental level. I think any modern wannabe dictator should look at these examples and realize that death could come for you in the most horrible way, and for any of us for that matter. There is a great, darkly funny film about these events called The Death of Stalin. Watch it if you have a morbid fascination in this subject matter. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoy this content, please remember to subscribe and let me know in the comments if there's any other dictator you'd like me to have a chat about. Stay healthy, stay safe, and remember, the truth will set you free.